Hello and welcome to July CRC meeting. My name is Allison Justice and I'm going to talk about what's new in cannabis terpenes and terpene processing. So for today, what I want to talk about is a little bit of the basics of the terpene structure, the basics around terpene extraction and what's currently used, the value in understanding terpenes and understanding terpenes with different drying methods, and then understanding that we are very far from understanding. And as I was reading through different journals, looking at essential oils and terpene extraction with different types of plants, there's a lot known, but also in plants other than cannabis, there's a lot unknown. So it's an exciting piece of the puzzle to jump into, but like many things in cannabis, we still have lots to learn. So what are terpenes? They are secondary metabolites. They're volatile, they're natural, and they're organic. And if you think back to organic chemistry, that means that it contains a carbon. Terpenes are built up by isoprene units. And what this is a carbon unit of 5. And so if you go over and look at the table here, you'll see the different types of terpenes, the numbers of carbon atoms, and then the number of isoprene units. So, of course, 1 isoprene unit is 5 carbons, 2 equates to 10, and so on. And so this is important to understand because the more carbon units you have, the heavier the molecule and the difference of extraction. So there are many types of terpenes, and so as this table shows, it's really determined by those amounts of carbon units as well as other elements connected. Terpenoids, which you may hear a lot, are the oxygen-containing terpenes. There's so many uses for terpenes, some that we do realize and some that we don't. So, of course, medicinal properties. What you see on the right there are menthol crystals. Capsaicin, kind of the opposite, provides a heating feeling, whereas menthol provides a cooling feeling that you might have felt with Bengay or some sort of athletic pain relief cream. They do change the feel to be hot or cold, but it doesn't actually change the temperature of the skin or inside the body. Terpenes can be used for antidepressant, anti-inflammatory, and this is kind of where it blends in with cannabis. I'm sure you've heard of the entourage effect, so that idea of the medicinal effect of the terpenes mixed with cannabinoids to provide a very unique feeling, potentially by strain or variety. We've all used terpenes as an insecticide. So if you think of maybe rosemary oil or pyganic, which was a huge thing for cannabis growers before many of the pesticide laws were kicked in. But all of those are pyrethrins, and there's many more I haven't even mentioned. Terpenes are global air conditioners. So these aerosols of terpenes released by forests hover over the forests and provide basically a layer of shade from the sun where they can be cooler. So many amazing things. Actually, I'm going to show you a table that I found. So this is a really cool table I found that kind of breaks down the different isoprene units and the terpenes within, as well as what we use them for. So going from 1 to 8, I think 8 and plus was one of the coolest ones that I just didn't realize. Rubber, latex, all comes from plants and technically is considered a terpene. We've got our pigment molecules and coloration. We've got terpenes and smell, of course, that we're all used to, more. The list goes on and on of terpenes and their uses. Menthol, citral. One thing that I find very interesting and that has been a big topic point is labs, terpene expression, what the nose smells, what the numbers say. It doesn't always match up, and what that does is gets cultivators mad and starts blaming the lab that they don't know what they're doing or that they're messing up results. But of course that could happen time to time, but really I think it's just our misunderstanding, and that is of, well, what are we measuring? Here are some recent results that show, I think, 20 something terpenes, but there are hundreds in the plant that we're not even reading. So what is shown on a test result is going to be much different than what our nose might be able to perceive. The other thing is the individual terpene itself. I found that some, even though it might show a low number, are more fragrant than others. So noses matching numbers, it's not always the same. So in this example, we've got two, this is actually hemp varieties that are both pretty good, I would say, as far as concentration goes. We've got myrcene domination here and here. We've got beta-caryophyllene, both being the number 2. But when you smell these plants, they're completely different. Completely. One smells like peaches and one smells like raspberry. I know those are both fruit flavors, but for the most part, if I were to get one that was super gassy, most likely its dominant terpene is still going to be myrcene. But it's the combination of all of these other terpenes and the ones that aren't even listed here, plus probably some other compounds that we don't even test for yet, that really give that rainbow of aroma, of smell that we've grown to love. All right, so this is a great example from my stock. This one is called Bell. And the nose and the numbers do not agree. I mean, look at this. This is pretty terrible. 0.6% terpenes. But this plant will knock you down. The other thing that I've found that's really cool, it happens with this plant. I've got a couple of others that I could kind of put this asterisk beside, is that you dry and cure this plant, you put it in a container, and you set it and forget it. And so this being hemp, I can do this. You probably wouldn't do this with marijuana, but being hemp, we take this, we put it in the back, just store it as biomass, and you come back in 6 months or a year, and it still carries that really amazing juicy fruit note. And so this one, we say it smells like the gum juicy fruit. Well, I have other varieties that, are sitting in a non-climate controlled space that have been sitting there for 6 months or longer, and you open it up and it's just a hay kind of musky smell. You wouldn't even know it's cannabis of any sort. Whereas with this variety and a couple of others, it might not be as loud as it once was, but it's still there and it still holds on no matter how hot the temperature, no matter the humidity, etc., etc. And so I cannot pinpoint that to one of these terpenes you see on the right, much less pinpoint it to a concentration, but something's there. Something is there to investigate, because it's just interesting and different that it holds on so long. All right, and then, of course, as we were talking about, we have those certain terpenes that could be in the most minuscule concentration, but they're so loud. And so this one right here, this is what we call THM Jack, and we call it that because it smells just like what you would experience with the legendary Jack Herer. And so, for most people that are familiar with this, the first thing they think of is terpenoline. Well, absolutely. The highest concentration single cannabinoid, or I'm sorry, single terpene here is terpinolene. But you can see it's only 0.25% of the dry weight of this whole plant. And it's just so neat to experience. And when it's dried and cured properly, you open the container and it's like someone sprayed a chemical right in your face. And I say that because it's very piney. But this one is also one where if it's not stored in an airtight container, even better with it purged with nitrogen, it will leave really quickly. So even in great conditions, you know, airtight or not airtight, but in one of those, what are they? Loctites, the yellow lids, black bottoms, even sitting in one of those in a 65-degree room, within a month or so, that smell is just gone. So it's very interesting to see just anecdotally how some of these terpenes move and respond due to different conditions, drying conditions. It's pretty incredible. So I would love to hear how it works with you guys and what you've experienced in your facility. I think we could put some pretty cool notes together and understand very quickly, if yours is terpinolene dominant, you might want to store in this sort of way in order to keep that really pleasant aroma, etc., etc. Here is one that has been very, very interesting to me. This one is Luck, and we have called it Luck because it is a CBD variety. It's a CBD variety that does not go hot. And so I know a lot of you may not be in the hemp industry as well, but having an actual variety that can finish and not be at 0.5, 0.6 is pretty rare. And even more so for it to be a smokable flower quality and hit those metrics is even more rare. But this is why we called it Luck. But something that I've noticed over the years is that caterpillars are not drawn to it. In our field, we do large trials. So I've got hundreds of varieties, hundreds of smells going on, and thousands of caterpillars. And it's very obvious which ones they're feeding on. This one, it just seems like it's a last resort kind of plant. And, all we can do is go back to the test results that the labs have provided us. And when you look at it, we've got myrcene and we've got pinene and we've got caryophyllene, very, very common terpenes that you see in many other plants. And so why? The number up here beside the name, that's the total concentration of terpenes. And so, yes, the total concentration is lower, but not much lower than something like Bell that I showed you prior. But they will absolutely destroy Bell. So it's very interesting to see that effect. There are actually some entomologists at Alabama State University that are digging into this. They're on their second year of investigation of insect versus plant, specifically versus terpene. I'm hoping one day in the not too distant future we can have them on to talk about some of their results, give us a little sneak peek. But very interesting, and I think there's something to that as well. Thinking in the future, if you are a marijuana producer and your specific goal is to grow for isolate, then wouldn't this be your choice? If you're growing on 10 acres outdoors, you would want your plant to have this trait where the caterpillars wouldn't be as damaging. All right, so terpenes are complicated. They're complicated because every step you take with them can change them. So let's think growing. Of course, variety is going to change the terpenes that are produced, but more so growing. And so as I was preparing for this talk, I started reading for basil and for rosemary, lavender. What are those scientists looking at in order to not only understand how the terpene production work in these plants, but how do they manipulate it? And so, I think we could talk about those studies for days, but the big takeaway is a lot is determined by environmental conditions. I was able to look at some studies that show, light intensity, PPFD, can drastically change basal terpene expression. And it was one study, pretty cool. If you're interested, hit me up. I'll give you the link, showing where they not only measured the terpene expression as far as analytically, but they also put it side by side of customers eating those leaves that they're testing. And it wasn't the leaves with the highest concentration of terpenes that were the most desired by the customer or by the participant. They actually liked the ones, I think it was 1, 2, 3, and 400 ppfd, with 400 producing the highest concentration terpenes, but 200 was by far the choice of the participants. So I think with cannabis, over time, we'll have studies showing this as well. If you're growing for terpene extraction, sure, maybe you should go with the highest light. But if you are going for a smokable flower, maybe they don't want as high of concentrations because it's harsh. In the basil example, they called the ones with higher concentration spicy. They didn't like the taste as much, even though it was the same individual terpenes. So the environment can be a big factor on smell. Harvest and trimming, as you know, different drying methods, different trimming methods at different times can all influence not only amount of terpene lost, but ratios, actually changing the smell that you're perceiving by certain drying methods. Curing. I think we've got an immense amount to learn here, but I personally have smelled flower that wasn't cured that ends up smelling like hay, and some that were cured of the same variety that smell great. Now there are all sorts of factors that go between that. Is it the actual curing step that brought that up, or was it because when you didn't cure it, it was out in the wind? There's just so much to it, and each one of these steps can change the smell of that flower. And so it's really cool to kind of step back and think, one day, are we going to have all of these completely nailed down for an individual business based off, one, what the consumer thinks, and two, what our business practices, what are we growing it for? Of course, grinding, depending on the type of grinding, this can change it drastically. There's some grinders that produce a lot of heat, and so this heat can change that terpene profile. Even more so, extraction. Are you extracting with butane? Are you extracting with CO2? Are you extracting only for terpenes? All of this can really drastically change the smell of those plants or of those products you're looking to sell. All right, so let's talk about extraction and just kind of the basics behind extraction. So CO2, as growers, we're used to CO2 being what we put in the room to speed up growth. Well, this is not exactly the way the extractors are using it. All right, so this is a CO2 extraction piece of equipment, and on the left is CO2 terpene fraction. All right, so just the basics of what happens here. So CO2 is in the tank as a liquid, right? We pull up a tank just like you would use on beer or maybe in your grow room. You put it through a pump where it is put into a high pressure as well as a high temperature, goes through the material, acts as a solvent. The pressure and temperature is brought down and then is collected through a separator. And then what's cool about CO2 extraction is that a lot of that CO2 can actually be recirculated and used again. These are two graphs that I found to be pretty handy in helping understand the basics of CO2 in regards to pressure and temperature. So of course at high pressure, low temperature, we have solid CO2. This is dry ice. We have CO2 gas, which is what we're used to as cultivators. It can be pressurized and can go into high temperatures and stay a gas. But at a certain high pressure and high temperature, we move over to this graph, and this is where we get the supercritical fluid form, where CO2 acts really nicely as a solvent to pull out certain compounds from plant material. When you hear about people using CO2 for extraction, it's usually within this form. It is tunable, but there are limitations. And so when people use CO2 extraction for terpene extraction, this is not a good fit. You actually have to go to subcritical, and that is where you're able to pull off those lighter molecules, only the terpenes. All right, so what's the difference between these? So supercritical, very high pressures and temperatures. The CO2 becomes a solvent. It's in this in-between state of a liquid and a gas. Again, very high pressures, and it's a relatively short cycle. Once you go to subcritical, it is less pressure and less temperature. It's less harsh on terpenes, and it acts as a liquid. But this is a longer cycle, and it's actually really quite terrible extraction efficiencies. So here's an example of a test result from CO2 extraction on one of our varieties belt. You'll actually hear of this called high terpene extract because it does contain quite a bit of cannabinoids. I was actually surprised how much actually still exists. It's interesting. This is almost, the numbers you would see on a dab or a concentrate source like that. 41% cannabinoids. And I'll show you later on, after we talk about distillation, how this compares to steam distillation. All right, distillation. This is one that I'm much more familiar with because we do have a steam distiller at our facility. It's pretty basic, and in theory, pretty much the same thing you would do to make moonshine, extract basil, essential oils, do distillation in the form of cannabinoid distillation. It's basically pulling off certain molecules. So we have our steam supply that goes through the plant material. This vapor, which is water and essential oils, is condensed. And so the vapor is condensed with cold water, comes down, and is collected. And so the thing to keep in mind here, that the collection is not just terpene. It's actually a mixture of the essential oils and floral waters. So we'll get into that in just a minute. There are other things you can do to a distillation setup. And again, this is whether you're distilling cannabinoids or you are distilling for essential oils. You can add vacuum. And so again, thinking back to chemistry, if you apply vacuum, what What is the perk? Well, you can pull different compounds below their normal boiling point. So if you have a substance that is very unstable, that will oxidize very quickly, that high temperatures can decompose and ruin, this is potentially a good way. In my experience, it is a good way to keep the oil from having we'll call it a rank smell, but it also pulls a greater efficiency. So you're getting more oil in that same time period. And there are all sorts of other things you can do to increase the smell and the efficiency of distillation in general. But these are just the basics to help you get a understanding. This is the visual difference of CO2 and steam distilled. So here we basically have a low concentration of cannabinoids with terpenes. These smell fantastic. I wouldn't say it's 100% exactly smelling like the flower. Steam distilled, you have that breakup of hydrosol and terpene. Sadly, it's a little bit further from smelling like the actual flower than CO2 extract. But you've really got to start thinking about, at this point, what's the price difference? What's the efficiencies of the extract? And how much of a difference is okay depending on what product you're putting it in. For a vape, maybe you want something a little closer to the smell of the flower. Maybe on certain varieties, the steam distilled oil does smell better than the flower. And I've experienced that too. So a lot to play with on this front. Hydrosols are interesting, and I think they've not got enough attention as they will and as they need to be. So this is just that floral water. There's lots of different names for it, but it's predominantly made up of the hydrophilic compounds of the plant with a minute number of essential oil compounds. This is used all the time in the beauty and perfume industry. You'll see in the stores everywhere, from local CVS to Walmart to, the most expensive shop you can think of. There's rose water. A lot of times it's used to put on the face to be, antimicrobial, to give a refreshing feeling. But when you steam distill cannabis, you also have these hydrosols. So this is a video showing, here we've got dry ice, and this is coming out from the condenser, and you can see the actual level here, or the separation of terpenes and hydrosol water. And it's been really cool watching this as we've kind of tweaked and changed our protocols, because at the beginning hour or so, the hydrosol portion is very cloudy and very fragrant. But as time goes by, that water becomes clear and not quite as fragrant. So in my mind, what represents the hydrosol is this cloudy portion, and it smells great. Again, being in hemp, I can destroy things and not lose a ton of money just because of the difference in worth. But, we have gallons of this hydrosol, and, I've read so much where people use it as an insecticide and a fungicide and all sorts of other things. And so I thought, all right, well, let's just leave it in the heat for months, and let's just see if it grows something as water would, just sitting there. And it doesn't, and it still smells really fantastic, if not better, over time. So again, I'm just throwing out ideas and random factoids of what I've seen, but I think time will help us understand some of these theories and some of these things we're noticing. Okay, so this is pretty cool. This is the difference between CO2 extracted terpenes and steam distill extracted terpenes, both from the same variety. Well, with CO2, keep in mind it was 40 something percent cannabinoids. Well, it's only 26% terpenes. Again, still smells great, but as far as efficiency goes and having a reason behind extracting terpenes, this might not be the most profitable way to pull terpenes if you can get just a good as smell through steam distillation. So steam distillation, this was one of our runs where we're getting 99%. You put a drop of water in the terpene and it goes directly to the bottom. The testing lab says this is most likely 100% terpenes. We just don't test for all that's there. So if we look at what dominant terpenes are pulled, we've got myrcene, terpenoline. They're very similar, but obviously there's a higher affinity for other terpenes in the CO2 extracted versus steam. So what we're looking at here is affinity. What we're looking at here is efficiency. And so I think at the end of the day, the nose and ROI should be the guide on what your specific company should be doing. This is distillation, but microwave assisted. This has been ran with other botanicals and does have a really great efficiency, but it's extremely expensive. And so if we're thinking large scale cannabis in the long run, I don't know if it would be the best bet, potentially. Butane creates really, really aromatic oil extraction, but it's not tunable. So you get what you get. It makes really good concentrates, but you cannot only pull the terpene profile. Of course, there's other solvents, mainly not tunable, so aren't actually used for terpene-only extraction. So this is a pathway we looked at earlier. And a lot of times these end products are based off of maybe the equipment that your facility has, maybe the type of processor that's near you, or maybe what the consumer wants. But as margins get smaller and production gets bigger, we really need to start at the end product and work our way backwards and do each step the most efficiently and the most cost effective. I think there are certainly ways that each one of these steps can be optimized. Of course, growing, larger acreage, larger scale, starting to plant with tractors. All of these things can speed up the process and make a business more profitable. Here with harvest and trimming, we can start implementing mechanical equipment to speed things up. We can have automated trimmers. But here with the drying, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. This is where temperature, speed, the amount that you're harvesting at one time, this is where it all kind of bottlenecks and can get tricky. This is where you really want to think about what you're growing for and what you're processing into. So we can slow dry, but if you've grown 2 acres, which a lot of marijuana producers are doing in places like Michigan, I know one farm's growing 14 acres. If you're going to slow dry everything as if it were smokable flower, you're going to need a really big space unless you've optimized your grow where you can stagger harvest. Still be a pretty big space, but it could be smaller. If you're heat drying, well, if you're looking to do extract that still contains terpenes, you might lose a large portion and your remaining oil will be not quite as valuable. If you're just going for an isolate, then that's okay, and that's the smartest move to make. We've been doing a lot of research with a gas company that works with different types of freezing methods. And that's what the next few slides will be about, is some of the research we've done. But I think this first slide just kind of will help you wrap your head around where freezing could fit in. Because if you think about the meat industry or other types of vegetables and fruit, freezing is a really good post-harvest step to make things last longer, to preserve that initial quality, etc. All right, so for outdoor growers, freezing. The great thing about freezing is that it puts it in a place of stasis. So microbes are not going to continue to grow. Or if you have 14 acres and you can only process 1 acre a month, then this still gives you that ability to have really fresh, high terpene content, but the ability to do it, to process over time. And while digging into this, it's been really cool to be able to see and understand what other industries do with freezing. Cannabis growers will have their own freezers and, be limited by that freezer size. But if you look to where other produce is going, there are probably multiple large freezing warehouses in just about every state. I'm talking ones that are 25 acres in size. You pretty much put a pallet at their doorstep and they keep it there as long as you want. And then you bring out, say you have 20 pallets, well, you bring one out at a time to process as you can. And so that puts all of that freezer cost into their hands with their insurance and their backup, et cetera, et cetera. So it's neat being able to understand these other industries and watch cannabis go and meet with them and take advantage of the pathways that are already there. So, of course, cannabis freezing, it just rapidly stabilizes the cannabis without loss of terpenes or cannabinoids. I think for the marijuana growers, the biggest thing is being able to hold that high value crop for different types of processing. Let me break that down a little more. So I've seen a couple places where they actually freeze it and then take it out slowly to dry. And this would be an example of this would be freezing a very large crop, bringing out a certain portion and drying it because they want to put it through CO2 extraction because it has to be dry. You can't do it wet. It gives you the ability to do live resin, so putting it through hydrocarbon extraction because you can do butane extraction with wet material. And in this way, you're not losing any of your terpene content. Or you could be doing what is getting very, very popular, solventless extraction. So this is your ice water hash, keef separation. This is your steam distillation for terpenes. These are really, really high value crop products that you can do on a very large scale if you have the right equipment. And then we have freeze drying. I'm sure you've all seen in the magazines, and I've been getting some spam mail showing. And then there's freeze drying, which at least in the hemp industry has gotten pretty popular, I'd say, in the past year. This is really cool. It preserves terpenes and it can make a pretty nice smokable flower. But in our experiments, what we've seen is that, one, it takes a very long time. So, it's usually a 24-hour process. It can be very expensive. Our unit holds, I don't know, maybe 2 pounds, probably less. And 24 hours and the piece of equipment was $5,000. So imagine doing large scale, you're really looking at investing a lot of money. But the buds are nice. The other kind of asterisk I would add to this is that it did change the aroma. It did change the smell slightly. We couldn't quantify exactly what it was losing and why it gave I called it a more chemically smell, but there was a difference than just hang drying. And so, freezing gives you this opportunity to maybe split your crop into different methods of extraction, but be able to hold it and do it over time if need be. So here's some different ways for cryo freezing. You've got snow horns, and so this is basically like a piece of equipment that makes dry ice right there and then. It's for smaller operations. You've got your cabinet batch freezers, continuous tunnel freezers, continuous paddle auger freezers. This kind of goes from small to large. These things are pretty wild, and this is equipment already used for meat processing and other botanical. It can be as small as 10 pounds an hour, or you can have something as big as 10,000 pounds an hour. And so just to have an idea of the cost of this equipment, this one right here, and don't write this down, but just to give a rough idea, this piece of equipment would be somewhere $80,000 to $150,000. And then of course you would have to buy the gas to keep it moving. What's really neat is the ability to trim the colas after they're frozen. So if you were doing something like ice water hash, this would save you a very labor intensive step of trimming before going through that type of processing. So if you look in this bin, those are almost perfectly trimmed. So here's loading buds that have already been trimmed into an auger style freezer. And so now these buds are ready to either go into the freezer or be immediately processed. Now the other thing that I haven't mentioned is when you are looking to have your flower frozen for whatever reason you're wanting, this is a really important step. If you have just a regular freezer and you attempt to put biomass that is even at room temperature, not even considering being very hot from being in the field, into the freezer, it's a lot of work for that freezer to completely freeze through this material depending on the volume you have. We've had farmers that have told stories of putting their flower directly into large boxes or the large sacks, and even after a couple of days bringing those sacks out, the middle of this flower is not frozen, the middle of these containers, and that's because this flower is living. It's still putting off heat itself, as well as being microbes that can cause some damage and actually rot in the middle of this volume of biomass. So for really high quality products, unless you have some crazy expensive negative 80 freezer, this is going to be necessary in order to have a high quality product and not stress your freezer. The next two slides are going to show the difference in terpene profiles of these different treatments when compared to the flower that was not dried at all. And it's kind of mind-blowing and hard to understand what's happening here. So again, we've got our sesquiterpenes and monoterpenes, our treatments, and what the red indicates is the loss of the specific terpene within that treatment. So for example, the oven-dried lost 73% of alpha pinene. All right, and we're looking here in the green, which represents a gain. So the oven-dried lost 73% of its total alpha pinene, but it also gained 16% beta-caryophyllene when compared to the flower that was not dried at all. If you would have asked me what I thought prior to this, I would have expected some movement, in 16-15% up or down. But when you're looking at numbers that are losing 83%, 50% of a certain terpene based off of the drying, it's pretty significant. So this graph is really just providing another visual, another way to look at the table prior. But what sticks out most to me is myrcene, obviously because it's the highest concentration of this cultivar. And so the pink means that it was not dried. So as a fresh plant as is, without effect of drying, it contains 16% myrcene. But then you go down here to the air dried, and it goes down to about 9% of the total terpene concentration, whereas you go to oven dried and it represents only 2%. So within each of these terpenes, you really have variance in what happens based off of treatment. Again, just one more, little bit more condensed way to look at these results. We have our monoterpenes and our sesquiterpenes. This kind of representing our control of not dried, meaning this is what was there in the plant without effect of drying. Higher in monoterpenes. Sesquiterpenes represents, what's that, less than a fourth. All right, well, let's go to the oven dried material. We've got, obviously, a lower concentration and total of terpenes, but here the dominant type of terpene is sesquiterpenes. We have lost or had a change in terpene from this treatment. And so looking at the other three treatments, which aren't as harsh as far as temperature goes, it stays about, it's close to 50-50. So much different than the control, but also opposite of oven drying based on the type of terpene. I think the overall conclusion of high temperatures meaning a higher loss in total terpenes was safe to say a fact. The significant changes in chemical profile was associated with drying method. I think we can all agree on that. But it was interesting to find that it is actually a consistent thing in plants that it is the monoterpenes which are lost when compared to those fresh samples when you're looking at more harsh drying conditions. The other thing that I stumbled upon that as cultivators I think will investigate and learn to manipulate more and more is the effect of growing conditions with terpenes and terpenes expression, even before manipulating the post-harvest conditions. So light intensity was huge as far as concentration and profile. Time of day was very interesting. A lot of research has been done in jungles, and they have a completely different terpene profile, different smell in the morning versus in the evening. And will we be seeing the same thing with cannabis? Will it make sense one day to know that for this certain smell, for this certain extraction of this specific smell, we're going to have to harvest in the morning? Water was another huge one. And this was, again, really going back to jungle conditions where a lot of terpenes are harvested from. They look at the time of day, but they also look at, well, was it a rainy season or was it a dry season? And that in itself, at least in one or two papers I read, had more effect on the terpene profile than it did concentration. So holding off water, what sort of stress is that causing to produce a smell to go one way versus the other? And is that why we notice sometimes if we put the plants through the same post-harvest and drying conditions, they're still, just at least to our nose, we can smell a slight difference. Is it because something happened in the grow room that we didn't catch? And to repeat that, what can we find out? These are just a few of the papers that I looked at, with many, many more needing to be investigated to apply these principles, or at least understand how to start to apply and investigate these principles around cannabis and get the most of what we want out of our terpenes and the type of terpene profile they're within.